Welcome everyone to this week's IPLD sync meeting. It's the first meeting in 2023. And yeah, as every 2 weeks, we go over the stuff that people have worked on, I think now in the past 4 weeks or so, and then discuss any open agenda items, which we actually have today. So the nice thing is that today even I have an update because I dared to work the full past week on only multi-formats and IPLD stuff. So therefore, I have an update. So first thing is Rod actually contributed negative codec test fixtures, which he probably will also talk about, and implemented it for JS and Go, and I did the Rust implementation for them. And also then did run them on the codecs and have PRs open to fixing them. But the most exciting thing is that we already have a PR merge for DAG-PB, which is already passing all other test features, not the negative ones yet, but there's also a PR open, which means that finally the Rust IPLD DAG-PB codec will be, as far as we can tell, spec compliant, or at least, yeah, as good as it gets. That's great to hear because people are actually using it. So yeah, that's quite a relief. Then on Wednesday this week, I was asked, so Protocol Labs has this thing called Launchpad, which is kind of like a boot camp for Web3 and interplanetary things. And they asked me to give a shallow dive talk into IPLD, which I will do on Wednesday. And I have already prepared the slides, not fully done yet, but I've already linked them. So I need to make a few sites a bit nicer still, but that's the contents. It's so the audience is non-technical. So it's really high level, and I try to explain things hopefully in an easy way. We'll see how this goes. Because so it's basically the talk, 20 minutes plus Q&A. And then in the Q&A, I will find out if it was good or not. I will tell you in 2 weeks. And last but not least, I wrote up the application context proposal. That's a thing at the lab week and IPFS camp, where many people from the IPLD world and related things met. I've spent a long time on talking about things like CID version 2 and other things. And after long discussions, what we came up with is what I call the application context proposal, for lack of a better name. This is something that many people worked on and have discussed with me about. And this is kind of like a first draft. I've made it in a way like the interplanetary improvement proposals, because it is IPLD, but still you need to ask yourself the same questions as on an IPIP proposal, basically. So I use this format. It's linked in the notes. It's really like the first version that I finished today. I sadly don't know how much time I will have, but it would be great if people could have a look, especially Rod. It would be great to get early review on if this makes sense, or basically if you can follow what I'm talking about. And then basically, so my plan would be to send this out to the people I've discussed this thing with and get feedback, and then make an official proposal kind of, which relates to a discussion topic we have about CID version 2, because I would just retire this PR, and this is kind of the alternative. And I would say the most promising or the most worked on, I guess. But we'll see. So feedback is welcome. So yeah, if people have a time to look at it, we can also discuss it in 2 weeks, for example. Cool. Yeah. That's all I have.
I guess that makes me going next. So lots of little things, but two of the bigger things in the last, I guess, this year are done. Oh, sorry. And a couple of interesting bug reports by Ghazala, Rakli, mainly coming out of the JavaScript stack. But one of them was highlighting the fact that our JavaScript codecs will allow decoding of duplicate map keys without having a problem with it. Particularly DAG-CBOR and DAG-JSON. So if you give it a map, if you feed it a block and there's duplicate map keys, then only the second one will be used, or the last one will be used. So you can have as many duplicates as you want. And yeah. So the Go codecs don't do this. The Go codecs will reject and say that's bad data. Anyway, so we released a new major version of DAG-JSON and DAG-CBOR that will reject duplicate map keys in the blocks. Not that I've ever seen them before. We're not aware of any of these in the wild, but it's one of these ways of hiding data or adding extraneous data to blocks to get different CIDs. And it's not a huge deal, but it sort of closes one of those very weird corner cases. So, and then out of that work as well came negative test fixtures, which I just sort of bit the bullet and finally did that after we had two of these reports about codecs, and they're both the kind of things that it would be nice to have negative test fixtures for. So, and we've been talking about it for ages, that we want to have failure cases. And actually, I think I've linked to the wrong pull request there. So the pull request I've linked to is for negative test fixtures for the duplicate map keys. But the one I'm going to link now is actually the original one. So the idea with these is they are failure cases for codecs where there's two modes that these get run in. One is where you've got a block that is the bytes are bad. So they're targeted at specific codecs where you will have some bytes and a codec, and it's supposed to error. And there are error messages in the fixtures, but they're optional for codecs. So some codecs may or may not use those error messages. I just based them on, I think I based them originally on the JavaScript errors. In DAG-PB, many error cases are the same between the Go and JS codecs because they're sort of written to match each other. But the stacks are different enough that the error messages are not always consistent. And then the other case is where you have a data model form in memory and you want to encode it. And so there are many cases where you have something in memory that you can't encode, particularly for DAG-PB, because it's such a restrictive codec. You can have lots of forms in memory that you can't put into DAG-PB. That's just how it works. So those go the other way, where you've got data model form written in some other form. So either DAG-JSON, because it goes nicely in JSON fixtures, or I think I've got a hex version. So hex for I think DAG-CBOR. You can represent DAG-CBOR as hex and instantiate that into the data model, and then be able to put that into the codec that you're trying to test, and then test an error on the way in. So yeah, those two things are in there, and there's lots more cases. I mean, this is an area where failure cases are almost infinite. So you've got to be judicious in what you add. So that's in there. Lots of stuff to do. We've already been talking about additional things that we would like to add in there. Anyway, that's me.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any updates or want to give any updates? If not, then we go to the agenda items. All right, so on the list, we have the next steps for CID version 2. So I think that's the PR I'm aware of. Let me quickly pull it up.
Yeah, we put this on the agenda, just
Yeah.
coming out of some IPLD triaging. It's noting that we've got at least 2 issues and pull requests open, talking about CID v2, and it's not clear where we're going next. And so actually put it on the agenda because you've taken mostly responsibility for
so I've also talked with the person that created the pull request originally with John at Lab Week as well, and he basically said also he even doesn't think himself that this way is a good idea anymore for his use case. So he wouldn't push it further, and I have this other proposal. So I would be happy to just close it and then probably put, when I have a proposal, put a link in there, but it can also be closed beforehand because I can then link it if people find it. But I'm happy to close it because I don't think it's going anywhere. But I can what I can do is I can write a proper closing message and saying this is why I close it, and then I will do this tomorrow if people agree that we just close this issue, this PR.
Okay, so that's in your hands then.
Yes, I will do this tomorrow.
And then so there's the pull request, and then there's the original CIDV2 proposal that came in as an issue from Michael in IPLD, I think it was.
Oh, but is it the same? Oh, that's the, okay, I will, I would, is there, an IPLD? I will find it, and then I probably also would I don't expect that any of from Michael's one that this going anywhere, so I wouldn't expect anyone pushing it. So I would also close that one when I find it. Okay.
I don't know.
And say that there's something that works, and then
is it in the CID?
Or is it in multi-form? Yeah, somewhere
in multi-form. Yeah. No, I can't even remember now. It's not in CID. It's not in multi-codec.
CID, perhaps. Or in multi-codec could be. It's too many repositories.
Yeah. I don't know where it is. It's probably linked in the original one.
It's in CID as a pull request.
As a pull request.
Okay. Multi-format CID is a pull request. I can put it in the notes.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And then the next one was actually, and I think you're more over this as well, Volker, but it was this JWK JCS pull request. I just didn't have the brain space to be able to process this. So the interesting thing that about this that I thought was it's back to this challenge of signaling. They want to represent JWK in JCS, so JSON, what is it? Canonical form. So which is interesting because the canonical JSON, I think there's a case for that being a legitimate codec or a legitimate serialization because it is distinct from JSON. There are additional rules for how you encode, and I actually think that's a positive improvement over JSON that people could find use for in the multi-codec table. Not that anyone's actually requested that specifically, but then this is it's like a schema on top of canonical JSON, and they wanted a codec for that. But I think you've dived into it a bit more and come to some conclusions about it.
Yeah. So then I might have misunderstood what they're doing, because I thought it's so in the DAS message basically. So basically I was also having a hard time following what they're actually doing. But what I understood is that what they really want to do is they kind of want to use it as a what I call multi-codec. Well, basically just as a prefix for something. So it's not, so basically it's that what follows is, so basically the bytes that follow are this and this kind. And this is what they want to have the prefix for. So basically put in multi-codec in front, so they know the following bytes are this and this. And it's really, so this was really about the key only, I thought. So it's really about Let me see. I need to check it again. So I thought it's really about this key. Yeah. So so basically a prefix bytes with this identifier. This is all they do, I thought. But I might have misunderstood.
Yeah, maybe we need clarity because they have asked for it as a key tag, and yet in the original message, they want it for this proposes a codec for all JWK types, which yields a deterministic output. And then we get into there's a mini argument about the different forms of JSON. Because JWK is a way of representing keys, like it's a JSON form of key representation, and I don't know what you would do with a multi-codec in that.
Okay, good question. Oh, so I thought it's so basically what I thought, if you look at the last comment in there, like the comments before mine in the PR from Ellen Horvath, there's a link to this DID method key thing. And like and if you scroll up, you see like it's DID : key : something. And how I understood is for this encode, like this was some bytes somehow. And I thought for this encoding, they just want to have an identifier at the front.
Right.
So I think that did key uses is just the prefix, the first few bytes just tell you what the key type is, as I understand it, in did key. Sorry, I had not read this beforehand. I am trying to parse this on the fly, but I know Alan, so I feel duty bound to to help as much as I can here.
So one, to clarify our concerns here is, and this is a really tough area because we've got these gray area around it, but really at the heart of it, what we don't want to be doing is registering codec codes that get used in CIDs. If the intention is to identify something, for some other purpose, like if it really is just a prefix within the DID format that says all the bytes that follow are going to be, you do something else. I mean, it is a codec really, but it's not the kind of thing that you would see end up in CIDs. I know that sounds a little bit weak, but that sort of gets towards the heart of the concern here. And the fact that they asked for it as a key, it does suggest maybe it is separate. Yeah.
So if you read the last comment before mine, where he writes that they understand CIDs, and to me, this comment basically, so the last sentence was, which basically convinced me that they know what they're doing and just, don't want to use it as a CID, but really as a prefix for the key. But
and ultimately, this is our dilemma, isn't it? Is that really this should be a shared common table that people register their unique identifiers, and we've got to be careful gatekeeping it too strictly. But we do have this dilemma of people want to use it for signaling in CIDs all the time. So they want to make their custom codec. That's the thing we want to be careful of, and that's really an IPLD concern, not a multi-codec concern. Yeah, but maybe even that we should just we need to be more flexible on.
So in regards to this, in regards to the whole what do you put in CIDs and so on, also kind of touches my application context proposal, because as it enables many new use cases, I think it makes, I've also put it in there, makes the CIDs tighter and easier. And so I would hopefully, if this is accepted, say that CIDs, so the codec field in the CIDs is really only about, it's still two things sadly, but it's only about extracting links from the data, but also like getting the structured data out. So because like if it's IPLD data model, you of course want to be able to traverse the contents of the thing, but that's it. Anything else is then application context.
Yeah.
So this is also like kind of related to like how strict can we be and so on. I actually have a question for you, Rod, in regards to this, because what we've thought about this whole topic in the past week. I thought currently we have also like JSON and CBOR as coding. I mean, like not DAG JSON, but really like JSON and CBOR, which currently is kind of like more or less like raw from how it works.
Well, sort of. Raw. This is my slight disagreement with one of your other comments on the multi-codec table in the last week. Is it is more about just getting links out of it. There is about conversion, the process of converting to the data model. That has become how we've relied on. Codec.
Which I discovered when I like wrote this application context proposal. I then discovered when I did my talk about IPLD for the non-technical people, I thought about like how do I explain things, and there I discovered as well, that you're right. It's not only about links, because if you basically do pathing through IPLD within path, you really want to get into the structured data, and you need to know how to decode the structured data, because else you can't get into it, obviously. So I agree that it's more like this, but I kind of would say it's IPLD data model or getting links out, because the links could even be, well, you could say links are the IPLD data model. I mean, it's a subset, so links are a subset of the IPLD data model, you could argue. So whenever a codec, so there can only be things where you can extract things into the IPLD data model. It does need to be the full data model, kind of. Anyway, but like what I would to ask was, what if we would allow, for example, in JSON and CBOR, if we would allow links, because it would then open up the use cases that also Dig is after, which is I have like sometimes horrible, like you get all those problems with custom things and so on, but it would at least like, I think it would fit into the current way of how we think about things, because then JSON is really a serializer, which is not the full data model, but still has links, which is useful. So you can signal, I have those weirdly formatted things in there, which should be links. Everything else is up to you, kind of, but it's still JSON. And the same for CBOR.
And I mean, CBOR is easy because it's a tag, and we've registered a tag 42 in the CBOR table. So it's legitimately, you could do that with CBOR now. You could say, okay, CBOR is what is freeform. It doesn't really have as many rules other than you need to be able to get it into the data model, and that can come with links. So we could definitely do that with CBOR. JSON is different though, because it's when we do DAG JSON, one of the reasons it has to be different is because we're restricting the range of what JSON can represent. And if we're saying we recognize DAG JSON links in the JSON one, then we're actually restricting JSON itself. So I don't know if we want to do that. It could be something that you do as a post processing, but then I don't think it belongs in the codec.
Yeah, if you don't. So what would be the point what would be the difference if you want to be able to store any arbitrary JSON you like, why would you use then the JSON codec and not the raw one?
Because you want a data model form. You want to be able to instantiate something into the data model. So I want to link to a blob that's terminal, so it doesn't contain any links, but it has structured data in it. So I want to potentially path into that blob, and get something out of it. So the data model is so much more than links, and that's the whole point of IPLD is that you want to be able to get structured data in your blocks, but the links become this critical part that turns them into DAGs. But you do have terminal blocks that contain interesting data.
Okay, which I had a discussion with Reba like a year ago or so, probably already, that about like if we should also like introduce a distinction between like terminal things and not terminal things, like somehow, like again, like in an abstract way, like somehow, somewhere. But
There is.
Anyway,
how do you represent like a terminal leaf in DAG JSON normally? Is there a way without following the link to know that the link points to a terminal blob?
Well, using what we're talking about, if you don't, this is not normal practice, but you could link to a blob that's just JSON. So so the CID switches from this is DAG JSON to this is JSON, and that could signal it. And I'm just trying to let me see if there is an example of this hard coded into code that I think is instructive. I always point to this as one of the ways in which where is it?
Because that's kind of what he's asking for. He's asking. I mean, because I know the did key use case, he's asking for a link that without following it, it's going to give you a JWK, like a JSON object that isn't DAG JSON, that doesn't keep going, and it's like a string that points to a blob that's terminal. Like this string only leads to a blob. So I think he might be asking for that, whether or not it is a new entry in the table or not. He's saying that the did key use case requires a string that dereferences to a terminal blob. A terminal blob containing all of the JWK stuff, right? Like telling you what kind of key it is and everything.
Yeah, I mean, but if it's part of the data model, so if it's back to that one, its terminal doesn't contain links, so we would say that's JSON, and specifically they want to use JSON canonical. So then, if you were to have a CID to represent that, you should have JSON canonical, because then that gives you the ability to turn that into data model form. But I think that's slightly separate to this, but
yeah. But coming back to the DID thing, so is it so is the key a hash of something, or is it the actual data in the key?
I thought it was the whole database 64, but I might be wrong. It might be, yeah. I think you are not supposed to need any external data source to go from a did key to the JWK it represents.
My guess with this one, looking at that spec, the did spec with multi-codec, is that it is a codec in a sense, but it's a very specific codec. It's not a CID codec. It's a codec that tells you, what do I do to instantiate a key data from this next blob? Yeah. And it's like,
which water do I add?
That's the kind of use for multi-codec where it's like, okay, you're doing something interesting, go ahead and do it. We care about CIDs. This is not CIDs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get that. And they're not after the IPLD or even serialization tag. So that does say something else. So I think in this case, stick it to if it's got the key tag, you're doing something novel, we shouldn't have to be concerned. So yeah, you just step very close to something that we tend to get concerned about, I think, is the whole.
Yeah. Yes.
I was trying to find some code, just back to the other discussion about terminal blocks and stuff. The code has changed in JS IPFS, but there's been a couple of blocks of code in JavaScript particularly where for decoding DAGs and walking through DAGs, where we hard code a list of codecs that are supported, but we say don't bother decoding them when you're traversing a DAG, because you won't find anything useful in them. And we hard code CBOR, JSON, and raw. And so when you're doing a DAG walk, if you encounter a CID that has one of those codecs, so there's a bunch of like other codecs you might encounter that we can't decode because they're not loaded, like they might be loaded or not into the system. So we don't bother with them. But since we've got those codecs loaded into the system, if you encounter a block, a link to a block that has that codec, then it is hard coded. It goes to this hard coded list and says, oh, it's one of those codecs. I won't even bother looking. I'll grab the block because it's part of my DAG, but I won't bother decoding it because there's no point. I won't find links in it. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this question of links versus no links. It's still data that you want in many cases, but when you're constructing a DAG, all you need to know is that's terminal, and I shouldn't need to look in there.
So is that list of 3 codecs for terminal for end leafs? Is there, you refer to it as like for legacy reasons? Is there a desire not to add any more of those?
No,
like,
no,
not to say that. Yeah.
It's the system design is poor. Like, we shouldn't have to hard code these things. But I did have a thought. If we were doing something like this, then because we've been talking about switching JSON and CBOR to the tag serialization in the multi-codec table rather than IPLD. And I was thinking that if we bumped into a case like this, we want to go back to this case and fix it up. And we, instead of having a hard-coded list, you could take the output of the multi-codec table and say, is this tag serialization or is it tag IPLD? If it's serialization, then it's a terminal block. It's not going to contain any links. So you could actually use that as a flag, and then you could do it for every codec. We could actually apply that as a strict rule. And so you want to, and whether or not your system supports those codecs, you still have the information about it. Hey, and then you could actually provide information to the user. Like if the user says, I want you to collect all of my DAG, and the system gets to a CID that is tag IPLD and it doesn't have the codec, it'll say to you, look, I can't get all your DAG. There's probably more DAG behind this block, but I can't decode it. Or alternatively, it gets to a leaf and the tags is serialization and it doesn't have the codec, and it says, look, I don't have the codec for this, but I can still get the block, and I know there's no terminal, there's no links behind it, so you've got your complete DAG. So that's something we could do with those tags in the multi-codec table.
So like fetching the whole thing and being able to deserialize the whole thing are orthogonal. So some people might need only one, some people might need only the other.
Yeah, because in IPLD we got these 2 modes that I find useful to consider. One mode is something like a pinning service or a DAG storage service like Filecoin, where all the system cares about is being able to get the DAG, and sometimes to get the DAG in a predictive order. So a canonical order of a DAG. Sometimes that's useful. Often it's just I want to take a route and then get as many blocks, or get all the blocks underneath that as I can, because I need to put them somewhere, or I need to pin them, or I need to transfer them. That's a mode that is very common in these intermediate systems, like a pinning service. They don't need to understand the data in it other than how do I get links out of it, sometimes in the right order, to get all the blocks. And then there's a second mode, which is where particularly application developers, where their structured data becomes important. So I want to get the DAG, but I also want to go into the blocks to get the structured data out. So I find it useful to think of those 2 separate modes when considering these questions, because they do come into play, but separately. Very often, we've got these intermediate things where we just want to transfer blocks and then understand the DAG. That's all. We don't want to know what's in it. We just want to know how to piece it together. And that's a useful mode because you can be really efficient there. But then you're coming to these questions of, okay, I don't have the codec for that. I can get the block, but do I really need the codec? Because maybe I don't need to decode it to find links, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
and there I think like JCS might be. I mean, I don't really know exactly why this guy's my friend Alan is requesting JCS be marked explicitly different than JSON, but it is sort of like more structured data. It's like more deterministic JSON, because JSON could, like, if it isn't JCS, to the same data could be represented 2 different ways in binary. So I feel like JSON isn't a very useful tag. JCS is a more useful tag, even to represent the same data,
Yeah, and that's why that was my comment in there, that if somebody wanted a JCS or JSON canonical, whatever we call it, entry in the multi-codec table, that makes sense to me. But if I was to represent JSON data for IPLD purposes and I wanted canonical forms, I'd just go with DAG JSON, because that's one of the things it does. It's got a canonical form. JCS is like canonical. It's like DAG JSON that was written for JSON general, not IPLD, because in the IPLD data model, we're more restrictive than the JSON data model, or we're more restrictive than the way people use JSON in the wild.
Right.
I'm actually not that much more restrictive, but DAG JSON serves that purpose. But if you were to have structured data that you didn't care about links and you wanted to represent it as a IPLD block and you wanted to have rules, then JCS would make sense to me as a good way of doing content addressed JSON. Yeah.
Right. It's as unambiguous, but you know it doesn't have links.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's a legit codec. And what's more, you for our purposes, like all these intermediate systems, you could treat it just like JSON, because unless you are doing the encode thing, decoding it's easy. Like decoding just uses a JSON code. We could mostly reuse the DAG JSON decoder even if we wanted to, or just a JSON decoder to get the data out for looking at it and inspecting into it. It's only where you're creating those blocks that you need to have the serializer that does the right thing. So, yeah.
So I'm not sure about this one. So I would argue it's not a proper codec. To me, it falls again into the like other thing, which I hope to solve with the application context, because like to me it's still JSON. So it's a special kind of JSON, but it should be signaled somewhere else and not within the CID. But yeah, it's open for discussion.
Yeah, this is really tough because I can, there are reasons on both sides.
I can see the point. Like I can see the point, but then like to me the question is again like where does it end? So
yeah,
is for example like is GeoJSON is GeoJSON its own codec?
Well, but GeoJSON is the schemaed version of JSON. That's the thing. It's
okay.
Like when you start applying schemas, then like, okay, you've got the codec, but then you've got a schema on top of the codec. That's when it gets problematic because you're wanting to signal your schema within the codec. That's the problem. But JSON canonical is a subset. It's really a subset of JSON in a sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe it's not.
Yeah,
getting into the weeds.
Yeah, but I mean, I can see the point, and this would be a tough one, and I agree that there might be a point. But okay, so but at least I agree that like a good point that you made is that there's a difference between like a subset of a codec and a schema on top of a codec, or like a schema that defines what the codec should do. But is it like? But yeah. Yeah. Anyway, we can discuss it.
Yeah, but the fact that we keep on coming back to these discussions and we keep on having these interactions with people in the ecosystem that want to do things, it keeps on saying that we either haven't figured out the right answers here, or we haven't solved the right problems or have the right tools. So we really do need to make this whole thing go away by either having answers, or having tools. So
which is hopefully the application context. This is really my great hope that for like 90% of the cases, that's the answer. We'll see. Yeah.
You mean like a configuration, like parameterize what?
So it's so basically the rough idea is that it's just so instead of having it in the CID, you have it somehow external and use it as a signaling mechanism. And then, of course, implementations need to understand this additional thing, but this additional thing could be anything you like. Kind of like opens the world for like, do whatever you like. And the point is putting it not into the CID, because if you would, for example, put it into the CID, it would also change how the data model like what a data model is and how it operates and so on. And I would say puts a big burden on implementations. And like I think the data model currently is good enough for a lot of cases, and it should stay simple. It's still not simple. It should stay like this, at least for those cases. And if you have additional cases, then you do this more powerful thing, which is outside of it and not always serialized with it, because the other use case is doing it dynamically. So for example, you want to have, you have the same data, but you want to process it somehow differently. So you want to do a different kind of traversal or you want to have it processed in a different way. So there you basically supply the context of, I want to process it this way, but it's the same CID. And you then process it this other way, but the same CID. So it's kind of like, you can kind of have it not bound to really the data, but so it's things that are not directly bound to the data, basically. That's kind of the rough, but yeah, but feel free to read the proposal, and then, yeah, we can discuss it in 2 weeks.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll do that. I feel like I'm winging it. I should have done the homework.
No, but this thing's been bubbling for a while. It's this whole idea that you don't show up to data, and data is not data doesn't tend to be just free floating. A lot of the troubles we get into is by conceiving data as free floating out there, that you show up to magically, you happen across data and you want to look at it. It's sort of like the archaeologist form of data. Like, you've dug down and you've found this piece of data, and I want to look into, look, what could this be? And it's just an array of numbers and strings. And bytes? What do I do with this? That's how we, as sort of particularly those of us who create IPLD tools, we tend to think about data, but that's not how data works in the real world. Data tends to be used within an application's context. So an application has a notion of what the data is used for. So when it shows up to data, or the data shows up to the system, it brings this notion of, what am I doing with it? So that's all this context that comes in. Okay, I've got a block and it's an array and it's got some numbers and bytes in it, but I know exactly what to do with it because my context is contained within my application. But very often you want to signal that context to another person. So people say, well, I want to give my CID, but I also want to pass on some additional information about it. So here's my CID and here's a schema. So I want you to take the CID and the schema and mush them together, and then that's how I want you to interpret the data that you load when you find the source of that CID. That's a common use case that people want, because they want to express application context or data context along with the data itself. Here's these two pieces. So that's where the original CID v2 proposal comes from. Here's a link to the block and how you decode it into data model, but here's something else about it that I want to glue together to it. And I want these two things to be expressed together. And maybe I want to store those things, or maybe I want to pass them on to someone else when I'm talking about my data.
Right. I mean, I do think in a way, like, that isn't mutually exclusive, because see, like, I like the way you put it. With CBOR, we don't have this problem, but JSON refers to this whole, like, loosey-goosey, non-deterministic, like, there's a lot of dirty, messy JSON that's useless without that external context. And JCS is one of many more deterministic subsets, like DAG-JSON, that was made for contexts like this, where maybe you need the data to be legible to a biologist 100 years from now. And
JWK, I think JWK expresses it better. I mean, JCS is not quite as clear, but so let's say I encode my key as a block, and it's a JWK key encoded as a JSON block, and I give it to you and I say the codec is JSON. So you can grab my block, decode it, and you've got a structured object, but you don't know what to do with that until I tell you, oh, it's a JWK. So that's the additional bit of context, is I can tell you how to decode it, how to instantiate it into memory, into the data model. Okay, now I've got these fields, I've got a map, and I've got these named fields in my map, and they're, these values, great. But so what? It's then I say, oh, by the way, it's JWK. And then you say, now I know what to do with it. Your key is in here and it's in this algorithm and all that sort of stuff. So that's the additional context. And so in a sense, that's the schema for JSON, but it also tells you what you can do with it. And we have this problem as well with my favorite example is the Filecoin chain. The Filecoin chain is DAG-CBOR, and it uses a Blake2 hash, but that's beside the point, except for the fact that all the CIDs, all they tell you, if you link to any block in the Filecoin chain, all you know is that it's DAG-CBOR and it was hashed with Blake2. You can get the bytes and you decode the bytes, but they're all arrays. There's no maps in it and there's no names of fields. they're arrays of random looking data. It really is ugly data if you just decode it into DAG-ZBOR. But when you bring the schema of each of the different blocks in that chain, you can bring a schema, and then you can transform those arrays into maps, because it says, oh, well, field 1 is this, field 2 is this, field 3, in the array, they actually transform into these struct objects. And you can do that, but there's no way of, if I give you a CID to a random block on the Filecoin chain and just say, go and get this and do something with it, you'll look at it and you'll say, it's an array of random data. What do I do with it? And then I say to you, oh, well, here's the schema. And then you instantiate it into a map, and suddenly you've got these fields. So you've got a schema, but then all the additional context is, the key bit of context is, oh, by the way, that's a block in the Filecoin chain. that itself is a bit of context that that I have to communicate to you. But this is not a problem in the wild, because no one is giving random blocks of the Filecoin chain to each other without saying that. All these blocks are being shared through the Filecoin implementations. So that context is expressed within the application.
Interesting. So, but I mean, are they like, is the mental model more like, is MIME type the right place to? Anyway, sorry, I'll leave you alone. The week's talk in 2 weeks. I'll read the proposal.
Yeah, no, it's the right area. Like, you're thinking in the right place, but MIME type ends up being the codec. Like, okay, how do I turn it into something I can look at? But then there's all this additional stuff. So MIME type does push beyond what IPLD codecs do, because you can double up with MIME types. You can have text, but then you can have all these other things that apply different variations of text. But yeah, anyway, Volker's going to present something in the coming week or so that sort of sums up some of these discussions.
Yeah, so also thanks for the example about the IPLD schema kind of things, or Filecoin, because I will also add this to the document, because like that's, yeah, also where it can be used for. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So this was the agenda item. Oh, where is my HackMD? So this was the agenda item about the. So what's our conclusion on the JWK key thing?
I think merge it as long as the tag is key, merge it, and it's not really our concern. I think we've come to that conclusion, and I'll put some notes in the doc, in the meeting notes about it.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. All right. Okay. Cool. Anything else people want to discuss? We still have a few minutes left.
Alexandre just dropped something in the chat.
Oh.
Yeah, so I guess Marv was working on some stuff that seems to be related to this issue.
Yes, and that is interesting, actually, because IPLD URLs do some of this work. And there is a double up of functionality there with the CIDV2 desires, where where being able to express a CID and additional things as a URL does actually give you some of this power. So if IPLD URLs became a standardized thing, maybe a lot of these concerns would go away, because if I can give you CID and then query parameters that stack up and a predictable form, like, oh, here's my schema, and here's my ADL, and here's another layer of schemas, and this stack of ways to interpret this data, and here's a path. Once you've interpreted the data this way, I want you to go down into this path to get this piece of data. So yes, I think it's related, but it's not clear whether they're related, intertwined, or they're separate things, just different approaches to do something.
Thanks for bringing it up, because like I have on this document, I have a long list where I thank people, and I forgot to put Mauve in there, because they were also part of the discussion. Like, so I did think about like how many hours I've spent at Lab Week discussing those things, with people, and I think I came with something to like 16 or 20 hours or so. I've discussed this whole thing with different people, so many people. So I would also say it is certainly related, and also so basically they're also part of the discussion, so we really want to get something nice worked out. Cool. All right. Then I guess I close the meeting, and we see us again in 2 weeks, and then discuss hopefully the proposal. And of course, like after, like we still have 5 minutes. So if you want to stay for the after party, if you have anything that shouldn't be recorded, feel free to stay. All right, then goodbye everyone, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye.